All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on something pretty fundamental to, well, being human. How do we figure out what to do?
That's practical reason, right?
Exactly. Practical reason, and I think anyone listening is probably the kind of person who wants to get right to the heart of these big ideas, so let's do it.
Yeah, so what's interesting is there's been a relatively recent shift in how philosophers are thinking about practical reason. Traditionally, the focus was all about our inner world, beliefs, desires, intentions. Think about instrumentalism, like our reasons are just about getting what we want, or even Kantian ethics, which focuses on, principles guiding our intentions. They're both, in different ways, centered on these internal states.
Okay, so for ages, it was all about how our beliefs and desires sort of mix together to make us choose things or how to find these rational principles that, I don't know, guide our will or something. But there's a new direction here.
Yeah, there really is. There's this whole body of work now saying, hold on, maybe to really get practical reason, we need to understand action itself first.
Yeah.
Like the way we figure out what to do is tied up with what it even means to act. Almost like saying, to understand arguments, you got to understand what a statement is first.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So instead of starting with the mind, we're starting with the deed, the actual doing. And I think you mentioned like a distinction between full-fledged action and something less than that, like mere activity. What's that all about, and why should a philosopher care?
Oh, that distinction is key to understanding these debates. Think about it like blinking, right, versus sitting down and writing a philosophical argument. Many of these theories are saying the argument writing, that's a full-fledged action in a way that blinking just isn't. They're trying to find the special features that make some doing count as action, proper, and simple behavior. Maybe it doesn't have those features. And here's the thing. They think whether our practical reasoning is even valid depends on whether what we're doing is really an action in this special sense.
So it's not just like semantics. It's about figuring out which kind of doing is even in the realm of practical reason and all the rules that come with it. You mentioned 5 key features these theories look at. What are they?
Right. So there's the calculative structure of action, how intentional actions are built up in steps, like a process. Then there's attributability or ownership. Is this action really mine? Then there's this idea of action as aspiring to be challenging, somehow not trivial. And then there's how action fits into social practices. And finally, evaluative features of action, the way our values and our acting are linked up.
A lot to unpack there. Why don't we start with this calculative view then and those thinkers you mentioned, Candace Vogler and Michael Thompson. For someone listening, another philosopher, what's the gist of their argument about how action shows us reasons?
Candace Vogler, she makes a really interesting case, very anti-psychologistic, saying we've been too focused on mental stuff when we try to understand rationality, both theoretical and practical. She makes this analogy to Frege and Husserl. They looked at like the logical relations between propositions that understand logic, right?
Yeah.
She says we should look at the structure of actions to understand practical reason. So her big idea is the logic of our reasons isn't primarily in our heads, it's in the structure of what we do.
So Vogler thinks the problem with those older theories, like instrumentalism,
Yeah.
the view that reasons are always about getting some desire, is that they tried to explain it all with psychology, with what's
Right.
going on in our minds.
That's it. She says to really get what's right about instrumentalism, the idea that reasons are often means to ends, you got to get rid of the psychological parts. She says we should read the logic of practical reasons off the structure of actions, like how we figure out truth functional logic by looking at how propositions are related, regardless of what anyone believes about them.
Okay, now that is a flip, but for someone trained in philosophy, thinking of reasons as justifications for our beliefs or desires,
Yeah.
it feels backward. We act, and then we figure out the logic. Isn't that like, I don't know, putting the cart before the horse,
Yeah.
reconstructing something after it's happened?
I get it. It's a natural worry. But Vogler's whole anti-psychologism thing is about that. She's saying rationality isn't about the processes in our mind before decision or action. It's about the logic we see in the intentional action itself. Think about Anscombe's why questions. Why are you chopping the nuts? I'm making a salad. For Vogler, this shows how actions are made up of steps, and these steps point to a final goal. That's what defines the action.
So like that Deborah Madison salad recipe, chopping the nuts, slicing the persimmons, tossing it with dressing, each step is rational for Vogler if it's part of or a means to the finished salad, right? And it would be irrational to like keep chopping nuts after the salad is done.
Exactly. She calls a reason that justifies a step based on how it contributes to the final action a calculative reason. And she breaks it down further into means end reasons, like buying the ingredients for the salad, and part whole reasons, like chopping those nuts. It's part of the process itself.
So she's not saying these are the only reasons, right? More like they're foundational or assumed by other reasons. Like for an action to even make sense as practical reasoning, it's got to have this structure in place.
Yes. She says these calculative structures are non-optional or binding, like they're part of what makes an action a coherent, unified thing. And here's where it gets interesting for moral theory, because her view of reasons is internalist, meaning the goals that make our reasons valid can be different for each person. It means someone could be, get this, reasonably vicious. For her, immoral actions aren't necessarily irrational as long as they're coherent and actually achieve the person's goal, even if that goal is, well, bad.
Whoa. So on her view, you could be a philosopher, come up with a perfectly logical plan to do something awful, and still be considered rational. That shakes things up a bit. Okay, now what about Michael Thompson? He's also anti-psychologistic, right?
He is, but he takes a different angle. Instead of just reading the logic from the finished action, he focuses on our ability to understand inferences. He has this alternative reading of Frege, saying our grasp of how things follow from each other that comes first, and this practical Begriffsschrift, as he calls it, has actions as its subject matter.
So Thompson's saying our ability to understand how actions connect logically, that's more basic than our individual psychological states, and this shapes how we see the actions themselves.
Exactly, and he focuses a lot on the grammar of Anscombe's why questions. You know, the difference between saying, I made the salad and I am making the salad. He calls it naive rationalizations when we use the present continuous tense to explain one action as part of another. Like, why are you chopping? I'm making a salad. And he contrasts this with sophisticated rationalizations, which sound like they're about our mental states. I want to make a salad.
And Thompson's argument is that these psychological explanations, maybe they came later, maybe they're more complex. Like in his thought experiment, that action-theoretic state of nature.
Exactly. He imagines a community that only uses those naive rationalizations, right? They explain their action B by saying, I'm being because I'm A-ing, where B is part of A. But actions happen in steps over time, so this can get confusing. Someone could truthfully say, I'm A-ing, which includes a later action B, but not actually be being right now.
Like, I'm making dinner because I have guests coming, but I'm not actually cooking yet. I'm setting the table. So the naive explanation doesn't tell the whole story.
Right. So Thompson says things like, I'm going to be, or I want to A, or I intend to A. These develop to avoid that confusion, to put actions in order, you know? He suggests maybe we're wrong to think these always refer to internal states like desires or intentions. Maybe they're mostly about making the sequence of actions clear. He compares it to Sellers and the myth of the given, that we mistake a tool for describing our experience for a mental thing itself.
So for Thompson, these aren't always about inner motivations. They're about clarifying the order and steps of our actions so we can understand each other. But one key difference from Vogler-Thompson doesn't say only calculative reasons matter for practical rationality.
Yeah, that's a big difference. Vogler says those calculative reasons are the foundation, non-optional, right? But Thompson allows for other important kinds of practical reasoning. He even says, kind of surprisingly, that all actions have more actions as parts, whereas Vogler thought maybe some basic actions didn't.
Okay, so Vogler and Thompson, two different but really interesting takes on practical reason, both grounded in the structure of action. Now, let's shift to that second feature, attributability or ownership. Who are the key players there?
Christine Korsgaard and David Velleman are the big names here. They both focus on this idea, to be a real action, it has to be owned by the agent doing it. It can't just be something that happens.
And what does ownership mean, philosophically?
Well, for Korsgaard, it means the action has to come from the person as a whole, not just some random desire or impulse. So there needs to be some kind of structure, unity to the agent. That's what makes the action theirs.
So for her, a true action isn't just my body doing something. It's got to come from this unified self, this agent. That sounds more explicitly psychologistic than Vogler or Thompson.
You're right, it is. Korsgaard's definitely psychologistic. She starts with action, but then says we need to understand this person as a whole to know what good practical reasoning is. She's partly interested in, like, legal responsibility, how we hold people accountable for their actions. But even more fundamentally, she wants to explain why reasons are binding on us, you know, why we should follow them.
And she does this with this idea of constitutive standards, right? Like, a knife is supposed to cut, a dull knife is bad. So actions also have standards, things they need to be proper actions.
Exactly. She says the question of why something should meet its standards, it answers itself. If she can show that acting on certain kinds of reasons specifically, reasons that are universalizable, like Kotz said, if that's part of what it means to be an agent, well, that explains why we should act on those reasons. This leads to her distinction between acts and actions. For Korsgaard, simple acts are just things we do, but actions have to be guided by a universal principle that everyone could follow. So for something to be your action, you have to really endorse that principle.
Okay, but a philosopher is going to ask, why do we have to produce these special actions Korsgaard talks about? What's wrong with just, existing doing random stuff?
Yeah.
Like your slacker example, just letting things happen.
That's the big challenge to her view, right? And Korsgaard has a few responses. First, she brings in Wittgenstein, saying that for something to be wrong, there has to be a right way to do it, a standard you can fail to meet. If we could just redefine ourselves to avoid any standard, then nothing would be wrong and nothing would be something we should do. So some categories, you can't just opt out of them.
And then her second point, the really interesting one, is that analogy with the pod creatures, right?
Yes. Imagine these little pod creatures, all independent, trying to act like a human. To fool anyone, they got to be coordinated, right? If the foot pods go one way, the torso pods another, it's a mess. When they act together, with the shared goal in this case, fooling someone, they're like a single agent, even though they're made of parts. Korsgaard uses this to show why action, even for an individual, needs to be unified. It has to come from the person as a whole so we don't contradict ourselves.
So for Korsgaard, being an agent isn't some abstract idea, it's practical. Like those pod creatures, we need to be coordinated to get stuff done in the world. And having these general principles for acting, that's what makes that coordination possible.
Exactly. That's why being a slacker all the time doesn't really work. We have to eat, find shelter, deal with other people. All those things need us to act with goals in mind, not just do random stuff. So for her, agency isn't an arbitrary definition. It's something we need to function.
Now let's compare that to Vogler with this idea of universalizability. Vogler said you could be reasonably vicious.
Right, because she's focused on whether the action is structured to achieve the goal. She doesn't rule out bad goals, as long as the actions make sense in relation to that goal. Korsgaard's view is much more demanding, morally. For her, a truly free action is one that everyone could, in principle, do.
And their views on how we know it's our action are different too, right? Anscombe said, we just know what we're doing directly. But for Korsgaard, it's more like an ongoing project, something we have to work at by meeting the requirements being an agent.
That's a good way to put it. For Anscombe, you just have this direct knowledge of your intentions. For Korsgaard, you got to constantly make sure your actions are really yours by sticking to these universal principles.
You also mentioned a concern about how much Korsgaard's theory requires of us. Using the analogy of a totalitarian state versus a democracy or a market economy, could you expand on that for our philosopher listeners?
Sure. The worry is, does everyday life really demand that much internal coordination that we're always acting on universal principles? Is it more like a totalitarian state where everything is controlled from the top, meaning our unified self acting on these principles? Or is it more like a democracy or a market where lots of things happen without central control and maybe don't always fit those universal principles? Korsgaard's answer is that being a unified agent, someone who can act in all situations, that's just part of what it means to be a person. You can't just choose to be fragmented sometimes and unified other times.
So, okay, that's Korsgaard's position. Now, what about David Velleman? He also connects ownership to the structure of the agent, but he disagrees with Korsgaard on what that structure is, right?
He does. Velleman's coming at this from the free will debate. He's interested in whether we can really separate ourselves from our actions or the reasons we act. And he points out this regress problem with defining ownership. If owning an action means you endorse it, well, what makes that endorsement yours? And so on. It could go on forever.
And Velleman's solution is to find something in our psychology that we can't separate from without, ceasing to be an agent altogether.
Exactly. And he says that thing is the desire to act for reasons. Because acting, in the way we understand it, it means acting for reasons. You can't get rid of that desire without giving up the whole idea of agency. He calls it the constitutive aim of action.
But to act for reasons, that seems pretty vague. How does Velleman say this desire works? What's it aiming at?
Well, his earlier view was that it's about understanding what you're doing when you act, making sense of yourself. So a good reason is one that helps you make your actions intelligible, He had this model where desires lead to actions, and this desire for intelligibility is like a higher level desire that picks which ones we actually act on. But his view has changed over time. He puts more emphasis now on narratives, the way emotions flow together, the stories we tell ourselves, and also on character, how our actions express who we are. And he doesn't see it so much as a conscious desire anymore, more like a built-in drive.
So for Velleman, reasons are basically explanations for our own actions. Because desires or narratives, those explain why we do things.
That's a big part of his later view. And this connects to another goal he has, to make practical reason more like theoretical reason. You know, figuring out facts seems straightforward, but figuring out what to do is messy. He wants to bridge that gap by saying practical reason is really just a form of theoretical reason, but about our future actions.
And decisions, on this view, are basically like self-fulfilling predictions. Yeah. We decide what we're going to do, and that helps make it happen.
Right. They're different from regular predictions because the prediction itself, making the intention, can cause the thing to happen. So an action is kind of like a self-fulfilling prediction playing out, and the reasoning is figuring out the explanation that makes that prediction work.
You also mentioned a third motivation for Velleman, explaining how we usually know what we're doing when we act intentionally. He says there's this desire for practical self-knowledge built into us. But you said that claim gets some pushback.
It does. Lots of philosophers, and just regular people too, point to times when we don't seem to want self-knowledge. People who don't care about their motivations, scientists who are exploring the unknown, people who seem to avoid self-reflection. They're like, do we really all have this desire? Velleman gets some support from psychology, like cognitive dissonance, where we try to make our beliefs fit our actions. But critics say that's often about lack of self-knowledge. You know, we rationalize things instead of really understanding them.
But you also said maybe Velleman's not saying it's a conscious desire we feel all the time. More like it's needed for his theory to work, for us to be able to own our actions and for a practical reason to be like theoretical reason.
Exactly. It might not be something we're aware of, more like a background condition.
Yeah.
You also brought up some challenges to Velleman, like how do we know what counts as a good reason if it's just about predicting what we'll do? And does it really make sense to say we're always predicting our own actions?
Yeah, like if I can predict that I'll make a bad choice, does that make it a good reason to do it? And constantly predicting myself, that just sounds exhausting. Plus, there's the circularity problem. If desires and narratives are supposed to explain action, but we understand desires and narratives based on our idea of rational action, then the explanation doesn't really get us anywhere new.
Right. Velleman does have responses. He says maybe these seemingly circular processes evolved to make life simpler, you know, for social coordination and stuff. And he thinks his view could lead to a kind of Kantian morality where this drive for intelligibility eventually pushes us towards universal principles.
So, to sum up, Course Guard is all about the normativity of reasons, why we should follow them, and how a unified agent acting on universal principles makes that possible. Velleman is more about how practical reason is like theoretical reason and how we know we're in control of our actions. But like you said, neither one fully explains why some reasons seem stronger than others, even if they both meet the requirements for ownership. Which brings us to our third feature, this challenge-seeking view, mostly from Paul Katsafanis. What's the main idea there?
Katsafanis, he's inspired by Nietzsche. He says actions come from these underlying drives, and drives are always pointed at something, like an acquisitive drive. It wants to get stuff, so it creates these desires for specific things. But when you get the thing, the desire fades, but the drive keeps going, looking for new things to want. And he says these drives are all about overcoming resistance. It's not just getting what you want, it's the struggle, the effort.
So for Katsafanis, it's not passive, like just satisfying a desire. It's about actively striving for something and overcoming obstacles.
Exactly. And he says actions, when we choose to do them, they want to be active in a stronger sense. We don't just intend them, we approve of the reasons behind them, even if we know all the messy stuff that's going on in our minds. And he says to really approve of our actions, we have to approve of those drives. And that means approving of how they keep giving us these challenging goals. This is where his interpretation of Nietzsche's will to power comes in. Not about dominating others, but about wanting to structure our lives so there are things to overcome, to really use our agency.
So, kind of like Velleman, Katsafanis says there's another reason, on top of our regular reasons, this interest in challenging ourselves, even if there are easier options.
Yes, but the content of that reason is different. For Velleman, it's self-understanding. For Katsafanis, it's this wanting to struggle, to overcome things. He says this explains why some reasons seem stronger, we want to exercise our agency, so more challenging actions have more appeal. And he even says something radical for moral theory, that suffering, when it comes from overcoming real challenges, can be a good thing.
That goes against a lot of traditional ethics.
Mm.
Okay, let's go to our fourth feature, the practice view. John Rawls and Tamar Shapiro. How does this idea of social practices change how we see action and practical reason?
This view starts with Rawls's idea of a practice. Think of it like a game with rules, roles, moves, penalties. The important thing is that practices create these special statuses, like foul ball or strike in baseball. And from those statuses, you get standards for what's right and wrong within the practice, and reasons for doing things that are based on those rules. Shapiro takes this idea and makes it a whole theory of action. She says all actions are like moves in a big general practice she calls Intendo, and agent is like the basic role in that practice. Even practical reason is a status you have in Intendo.
So for Shapiro, to act at all is to play this game of Nintendo. And the rules of that game, those are what make our reasons valid.
Exactly. Because being in action is itself a status in Nintendo, she says all good reasons have to come from the rules of Nintendo. Like, if Nintendo says reasons have to be universalizable, like Kant, then all our reasons have to be like that. She even has a really different take on free will. She says it's like asking, can he do that? Meaning, is that move allowed in the game of Nintendo, not whether someone has some special power.
That's thinking about free will in a very social way. Now, you said Shapiro's view differs from Rawls in some ways.
Yeah, a few key things. Rawls mostly thought of practices as specific social things, institutions, games. He didn't want to stretch the concept too far, because then maybe existing practices would become the only way to justify things, and that could be bad. But Shapiro says all action is a Nintendo. And Rawls thought everyone had to know the rules of a practice, which isn't really true for Nintendo. The rules are more philosophical. Plus, Rawls was skeptical about finding universal features in all practices.
But Shapiro's goal is to end up with something like Kantian morality, right? By comparing Kant's universal law to the rules of Nintendo.
Yes. She says the law of freedom, Kant's big idea, is basically saying we should act like every move we make is part of a global practice, so it has to be universalizable. She has a few reasons for this view. She wants to combine ideas from different theories of action, and she thinks the world is better because of all the different practices we have. And it's interesting because even though she's trying to get to Kantian ideas, which are usually psychologistic, Shapiro's own view isn't about psychology, it's about the rules of Nintendo itself.
Okay, but now the question is, why is Nintendo so special? We can choose not to play baseball, right? Why can't we opt out of Nintendo and just do things that aren't part of this practice?
That's the tough question for this view. Shapiro's answer might be that we need shared practices to understand each other, to coordinate our actions. Maybe she'd even say we can't opt out because the very idea of acting depends on this framework of Nintendo. Her view of free will, what's allowed in Nintendo, plays a part there too. And she also deals with difficult cases, like lying to a murderer at the door. Kant said you shouldn't lie, right? But Shapiro says the murderer is not playing by the rules of Nintendo anymore, so your actions don't have to follow those rules either. She says the murderer's betraying Nintendo, but not opting out of it. It's a subtle point, and the practice view is still being developed there.
So lots of complexities with that view. Finally, let's talk about that fifth feature, evaluation. Sarah Buss and Talbot Brewer. What are their arguments here?
Sarah Buss says the difference between just moving your body and intentional action is that with action, you have to endorse it. And for her, that means believing that your reasons for acting are good enough. Without that, you're just watching yourself move, not really acting.
And she uses this to criticize Hume, right? The view that reasons are just desires and beliefs about the world, none of which are evaluative.
Right. She says if Hume is right, then there's no room for this judgment that our reasons are good. And she says that judgment is necessary for intentional action. So Humean theories can't explain action without contradicting themselves. It seems similar to Velleman, this acting for sufficient reasons, but Buss is focused on how agency is active, not passive. And it's important to note, she doesn't have a fixed view on what good reasons are or what the right moral theory is. She's mainly attacking Hume, and she's not really taking sides in the psychologism debate.
Okay, now Talbot Brewer, he has a different take on evaluation, focusing on dialectical activities. That's the important category. And regular actions are less important. They kind of come from that. What's dialectical activity for him?
He says it has two parts. First, you understand the activity better as you do it. And second, you appreciate the good of the activity more and more. His example is friendship. Being a good friend means learning more about that specific friendship and also understanding the value of friendship in general.
So while other theories assume that doing something is always just acting, Brewer's saying the most important things we do are these ongoing processes of understanding and evaluation. And maybe those simpler actions, they only make sense as part of these bigger activities.
Yeah, that's what he's suggesting. He thinks these dialectical activities, philosophy, art, living a meaningful life, these is what's really valuable for us. And it's different from views that say you need a clear goal before you act. With dialectical activity, you're always clarifying what the activity is and why it's good while you're doing it. Like your Vegas trip, if it turns into gardening, it's not just a change of plans, it's that the whole idea of the activity, maybe the friendship itself, has changed, so the goals and actions change too.
And he says what motivates us in these activities, it can't be a simple desire or a proposition because our understanding is always changing. And the activity itself, like living well, is in the present, not some future state. So how does this change how we think about practical reason?
Brewer says if we just see everything as desires and getting what we want, we miss the big picture of these activities, and that can even make them less valuable. Like with friendships, if we just focus on satisfying specific desires, we might miss the deeper value of the friendship itself. This also changes how we deliberate. It's not just figuring out how to get what we want, it's also figuring out what we should want, what's actually good. It shifts the focus from planning to really paying attention to what we're doing right now.
So instead of just asking, what do I want to do next, we should also ask, what have I been doing, like Bernard Williams said. And it explains why we don't like delegating certain decisions, because the thinking and evaluating is part of what makes the activity valuable. One last thing. How would you compare Buss and Brewer on evaluation?
The key difference is when the evaluation happens. For Buss, you evaluate before you act. It's a one-time judgment that your reasons are good enough. For Brewer, evaluation is constant, it's part of the activity itself. You're always understanding and appreciating it more.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into action theory. So many different views, and they all disagree.
Yeah, it's amazing how much this focus on action has changed things. But even though they disagree on the details, what good reasons are, how we should act, what makes reasons binding, they all agree that we need to understand action to understand practical reason.
And all the disagreements come down to that basic question: what is an action? We've seen so many answers. Something with steps, something owned by an agent, a move in a practice, something we evaluate, something part of a bigger activity.
It's true. And as this area of philosophy develops, we need good arguments to decide between these views. Like Nozick said, it's not enough to say why your view is right. You got to explain why the others are wrong.
And they all try to justify their views in one of two ways. Either action just is a certain way, that's just how agency works, or we should act a certain way because it's necessary or because it achieves some goal. And that choice affects how much their theory of practical reason can tell us what we have to do.
That's right.
So for our listeners out there, the philosophers, here's a thought. With all these different views on action, what does your own view say about how you reason practically? Which of these frameworks fits your experience of making decisions? What are your arguments for that view? It's something to think about as you explore this area of philosophy further. Thanks for diving deep with us.